Regulations actually dumb us down. They make us stupid. They make us dumb. They make us unaware of risk. And you can see that playing out over and over and over again. So buyer beware actually is a great strategy because it makes us focus on what we're buying, what we're investing in, what we're doing, with the acknowledgement that nobody's going to swoop in and bail us out if we make a mistake.
I am recording this on Friday morning, March 17th, and it is possible that after I am finished recording that we may or may not find out more about what's going on with Silicon Valley Bank, or any other bank-related events in the news. If you want some well-educated coverage on this topic, then I highly recommend checking out Yaron Brook on YouTube. However, I thought we might talk about this talking point that I've seen a lot lately, especially from the political left, who are insisting that this banking crisis was a result of deregulation. They particularly point to the reform of Dodd-Frank that was signed by President Trump in 2018. I have seen others say that what happened with Silicon Valley Bank is a result of, get this, unregulated capitalism.
Okay, you expect me to believe that load of crap?
So let's consider what happened with Silicon Valley Bank. The bank was getting flushed with cash over the years, especially from big players in Silicon Valley, and they decided to invest a lot of that money into U.S. Treasury bonds. Then the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, increased interest rates in an attempt to curb inflation, thus eroding the market value of Silicon Valley Bank's assets, which probably would have been fine so long as nobody made a run on Silicon Valley Bank. Otherwise, the bank might have to sell some of their assets at a loss to honor the depositors. But, as we know, a run on the bank was made, which prompted the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation to close down Silicon Valley Bank before the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, another government agency, took over Silicon Valley Bank. And apparently this is what unregulated capitalism looks like to a lot of knuckleheads.
You absolutely suck!
Some have speculated that the existence of federally mandated deposit insurance encourages more risky behavior, particularly the behavior we saw with Silicon Valley Bank. As Charles Calomiris, an economics professor, wrote recently for the Wall Street Journal, historically, unprotected, well-informed depositors, especially other banks, gauged and responded to each bank's risk, creating incentive for banks to manage risk responsibly. Uninformed depositors, like those now at risk at Silicon Valley Bank, were free riders on informed discipline. Now, informed depositors can easily get around the $250,000 limit on insurance, which eliminates their incentive to monitor banks. The recent disappearance of the interbank loan market means that banks do not monitor each other to gauge creditworthiness as short-term borrowers of reserves either. That leaves only bank regulators to mind the store, and they often lack incentives and knowledge to measure and punish risk on a speedy basis. That's how predictable messes like Silicon Valley Bank happen. Some may say that federally mandated deposit insurance favors worse, riskier, incompetent banks at the expense of more responsible banks, along with taxpayers. One of those people would be President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's even mentioned in this paper that was published by FDIC in 1998. Apparently, FDR caved on FDIC as a compromise to get his other banking regulations passed. In the book In Pursuit of Wealth, The Moral Case for Finance,
Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book.
Don Watkins writes about the moral hazard of deposit insurance and how it necessitates further regulations on banking in an attempt to reduce said moral hazard, all of which ends up making the banking system more unstable in the long run. This is actually a topic that I asked Yaron Brook about when I talked to him back in December of 2022.
When banks are unregulated and properly allowed to grow and to serve customers, you don't get this behavior. So the two freest banking systems in history of mankind, as far as I can tell, were the mid-19th century banking system in Scotland, and then most of the 19th century, early 20th century banking system in Canada. And both of those systems were unbelievably stable, had almost no government regulations, no bank runs, and behaved phenomenally. So no, we have, part of the problem is when you give deposit insurance and we regulate banking so much, you kind of create investor expectations that that's going to happen. And then investors don't take up the mantle of properly thinking about where they put their money. I mean, which one of your listeners thinks about which bank to put their money in, gives it a second thought? We don't, because of deposit insurance. Well, now extrapolate to, do you give a second thought about your money at Robinhood? Is your money in Robinhood federally insured? It's not. But how many of you even think about that? Don't you just assume the government will bail you out no matter what happens? So that creates a mentality of unthinking. And a mentality of unthinking creates instability. It creates more opportunities for fraud. So regulations actually dumb us down. They make us stupid. They make us dumb. They make us unaware of risk. And you can see that playing out over and over and over again. So buyer beware actually is a great strategy because it makes us focus on what we're buying, what we're investing in, what we're doing, with the acknowledgement that nobody's going to swoop in and bail us out if we make a mistake.
So I am of the opinion that in a free market, bank failures like this are much less likely to happen. I also think it's worth mentioning that it's silly to blame Silicon Valley Bank's failure on wokeness, as many on the political right have been suggesting. I guess this is to be expected when the political right largely abandons the realm of economics in favor of culture wars. Have fun with that, guys. Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk seemed to suggest that the $200 billion that Silicon Valley Bank had on its balance sheet may have been the money that was designated for Ukraine, which may sound plausible until you notice that Silicon Valley Bank was either at or near the $200 billion mark before Russia ever even invaded Ukraine. I seem to recall facts don't care about your feelings being a rallying cry for conservatives. And now conservatives like Cheesy Charlie over here toss out any half-baked crackpot thought that creeps into his fucking noggin. With that said, let's address the 2018 Dodd-Frank reform. Much has been made of the fact that the threshold for enhanced regulatory burden was increased from banks with $50 billion in assets to banks with $250 billion in assets, thereby keeping Silicon Valley Bank out of the realm of enhanced regulation. First off, it's worth noting that the 2018 Dodd-Frank reform that everyone is citing as deregulation still gives the Federal Reserve the authority to apply the enhanced prudential standards to any bank with $100 billion or more in assets, which would include Silicon Valley Bank, at least according to a 2018 article that was published by the law firm Sherman and Sterling. It also looks like banks of Silicon Valley Bank's size were still required to stress test with the Federal Reserve. Yeah, so much deregulation, you guys. Not that a stress test would have prevented anything, at least according to this piece on the Wall Street Journal written by Joseph Mason and Chris Miller. Michener, who explain how the stress test failed to encompass the scenarios that led to Silicon Valley Bank's demise. Economist John Cochrane wrote about how badly regulators dropped the ball with Silicon Valley Bank, noting that the risks of both Silicon Valley Bank and Silvergate's were in plain sight. Considering that regulators failed to intervene, I have a hard time believing that regulators would have done things much differently with the old Dodd-Frank rules. But let's assume that the Dodd-Frank reform never gets passed in 2018. Would this have prevented Silicon Valley Bank from 1, being flushed with cash over the years, and 2, would this have prevented Silicon Valley Bank from investing a lot of that money into US Treasury bonds that would eventually lose market value once interest rates were increased by the Federal Reserve? I guess one could say that it's possible. I personally have a hard time believing that people would rush to a bank to deposit over $250,000 for checking account rates during inflationary times, which also leads me to doubt that Silicon Valley Bank would have kept a significant amount of that money liquid. As Cochrane notes, Silicon Valley Bank was paying a bit higher rates than banks like Chase, and the depositors were financially savvy, unless the assumption is that the depositors just would never have banked with Silicon Valley Bank in the first place if Dodd-Frank had never been reformed in 2018. Perhaps Silicon Valley Bank just never offers the interest rates that they did with the old Dodd-Frank rules, in which case the depositors would have made other investments with their money, and who the hell knows what happens after that. I think this assumption is a bit of a stretch, but I'll let you guys decide if the old Dodd-Frank rules would have prevented the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. With that said, you could justify a lot of insane government regulation and action on the basis of damage prevention. Look no further than Communist China's draconian zero COVID enforcement, not to mention some of the insanity that we saw in the United States. One could easily point to heart attacks and other potentially fatal health problems and say, see, if only we had stricter regulations on food consumption and alcohol consumption and tobacco consumption, this heart attack may have never happened. And would this justify the government telling you how much food and alcohol and tobacco that you're allowed to consume?
No, of course not.
Speaking of damage prevention is essentially the justification for the current depositor bailout that we're seeing with Silicon Valley Bank. Nice work, everyone.